Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight. Tonight's program that we have, this is an MCNAYM Junior workshop for mentors and parents, and it's about coping with stress and grief. This session aims to provide parents and teachers with practical strategies to support children who may be facing bullying at school or struggling with emotional impact of the global conflict. And you all will gain valuable insights into how to foster resilience, open the communication, and create a safe environment for our children to thrive emotionally and socially. The session will also offer resources and tools to equip children with the skills that they need to navigate challenging situations with confidence and strength. And today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Suzy Ismail. Dr. Suzy Ismail is a founding director of Cornerstone that focuses on youth, family, marriage, identity, social, emotional wellness, and relationship building. She's the author of many books, including Modern Muslim Marriage, 9 to 5, When Muslim Marriage Fails, and several other works. She has traveled to the border of Syria to work with refugee women, families, and orphans, and she continues her work with resettlement and relief agencies um, providing integration intervention. And I'm going to actually hand this over to Dr. Suzy Ismail to go ahead and begin her talk.
Alright, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to have this forum in which we can connect and in which we can share our thoughts and talk about the difficult topics that somehow today it feels it's become harder and harder to talk about what we are feeling as a community, collective grief, what we are seeing happening in Gaza right now in Palestine, and recognizing that the pain is it's a difficult pain that is carried, I think, by so many of us as parents, as adults, as teachers, but it's also being carried by our children. And I think this is the most difficult part. So we really want to dive in today into better understanding what is it that our children may be seeing, what they may be feeling, how best to respond to those emotions, how to better understand them, how to empower our children with a sense of strength and a sense of iman and taqwa that can help them get through these difficulties, even when we ourselves may be struggling in so many ways, particularly with the inundation of news and visuals that we are seeing consistently that are so heartbreaking. So أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. So we really can't start a conversation on grief, on loss, on stress, on dealing with difficulty without beginning, with the remembrance of Allah, without beginning with centering ourselves, grounding ourselves, and recognizing that not a leaf falls in this dunya without Allah's knowledge of that leaf falling, and that everything that we see in this dunya, every tear that is shed, every drop of blood that is lost, every sorrow that is felt, every difficulty and test that is faced, Allah Azza wa Jal knows, and He knows what we do not know sometimes. And so we cannot begin a conversation about the difficult circumstances that we see and the difficult times we live in without first beginning with the remembrance of Allah. So what is happening, for so many of our children and for us as well as parents and adults? We know that, when the events of October 7th had occurred, and of course, we're going to ground this conversation in particular aligned with what we are seeing happening in our communities today, in our societies, in our world, essentially, and what is happening in particular, of course, in Gaza and in Palestine. And when we go back, to about a month ago, exactly, actually, today, we go back to October 7th. We know that the news kind of came across at us wherever we were, whether we were at work or, our kids were in school, we were at home. We began to hear the bits and pieces of the news of some terrible things that were happening in Palestine. And these terrible things that were happening, of course, were being reported in many different ways. We heard so many different stories, different narratives coming out of Israel in terms of what was happening, whether it was in a concert, how individuals were attacked, a hostage situation. And of course, at the focus or the heart of our deen is an understanding that our deen guides us towards helping one another. Our deen guides us towards saving the life of one another. And we know that it is, if you save a life, it is as if you have saved all of humanity. And so it follows that if you were to take the life of someone, that this, of course, is not something that's pleasing to Allah, that this is something that is unjust, particularly if there is an innocent and a life is taken. So this is not a part of our deen at all to take a life of someone. But what we were hearing, in October 7th was the consistent repetition of Muslims and Islam, and, the concept of equating the Islamic perspective with the harm towards others. And we know in our faith that that is not true. And that is the first step in guiding our children towards understanding, the horrors that they may be seeing, things that children in the classroom may be saying to them, a recognition that our deen is a deen that focuses on bringing good to others, being good to others, that Allah Azza wa Jal, in His infinite mercy, asks of us as ibad Allah, as, those who serve Allah, asks of us in every salah before we begin anything in our lives to consistently repeat Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And this verse, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, is the most often repeated verse in our deen for any Muslim. And it is a reminder, that we are doing everything that we do in life in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. So, of the 99 names of Allah, we are most often reminding ourselves and reminding others of Allah's attributes of mercy and compassion. And there is a reason for that, because as we consistently focus on the attributes of mercy and compassion in the one who has created us, we want also to embody the elements of mercy and compassion in the way that we interact with others. This is the essence of really acting upon our iman, acting upon our Islam, having mercy and compassion in our interactions. So first of all, being able to, remind our children of the beauty of Allah, the hikmah of Allah, the mercy and compassion of Allah, and reminding our children that we, as essentially the ones on earth who carry the legacy of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, must act in a way that is merciful and compassionate with all. And this means, as Muslims, as a part of our deen, we do not harm the innocent. We do not, begin anything that would be harmful. This is not of our deen. So we began to hear early on, in those early October 7th, 8th, 9th days, a lot of statements in the news. Again, statements that would equate our deen, would equate what it means to be a Muslim with bringing harm to others. And we saw, of course, very quickly the essential, the what was considered a retaliation from Israel onto the Gazans, onto Gaza. Now, there is a lot of historical context that I think our children sometimes don't understand. And we may think that our children are young, and so they don't need to know things. But knowledge truly is such an important factor in helping with fear, in helping bring things to light. And this is why when we look to the Quran, we see that one of the most often repeated words in the Quran is ilm, and the seeking of ilm and aql and fiqh, right? Which is knowledge is ilm, aql is rationale, and fiqh is thought. right? And so throughout the Quran, we're constantly reminded of these important elements. When we look to Surah Al-Rum even, and we look to verses 20 to verse 24, when Allah Azza wa Jal actually speaks about mawadda wa rahma in a marital relationship, we also see at the end of each of those verses, Allah Azza wa Jal reminding us, ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٌ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِلْعَالَمِينَ. A reminder that in these elements, in these relationships that are built between people, that there is a reminder or a sign in these relationships for those who give thought. There is a sign for those who seek knowledge. There is a sign, or those who have knowledge. There is a sign for those who listen. ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَسْمَعُونَ. There is a sign for those who use rationale. ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقَلُونَ. And so we see that these elements are so important, and we can't use our aql, we can't use our rationale, we can't use our fiqr, our thinking, we can't use even our sam'a, our listening, without also having something to listen to, something to rationalize, something to think about. And that in essence is al-ilm, the education. And so, guiding our children towards understanding the historical context of what may be happening, whether it is, the current devastation that we are seeing coming out of Palestine, coming out of Gaza, or any conflict throughout the world, whether it was the Ukrainian crisis that occurred, the Afghan crisis that occurred, and so many other crises, what's happening in Sudan currently. But educating our children in an age appropriate way from a young age, that is what empowers them. That is what helps them in better understanding and contextualizing the world around them. Because if we don't provide that education, then they are going to seek to fill those gaps in any topic, in anything that really strikes their curiosity. They're going to try to fill those gaps in ways that may not always be best. So, a child who may have a question, for example, about what is happening in the world today, they may go into Google and type something, type up their question. And yet we know, and many of you, I'm sure, in the separate WhatsApp groups that we're on, and seeing on social media, have seen how when a question is typed into Google or ChatGPT, that the response can often be biased as well. And so our children may be seeking out education in ways to fill the vacuum, essentially, that the void that they're missing, but it may be misinformation. It may not be the ilm that is originating from a place that is actually, truth, essentially. So we want to fill that void, and we want to be the source of education for our children. And subhanAllah, when you look to the Quran, Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us, لَنَبْلَوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِنَ الْخَوْفِ, right? That Allah Azza wa Jal tells us, surely we will test you with something of fear. And many of our children currently are afraid. Many of us as adults may be feeling fear. And the fear may come in different forms. It may be a khawf, or a fear that is rooted in seeing what is happening to those who are suffering, those who are struggling, and feeling a sense of anxiety in response to what we think should be the fear that they're experiencing. Our children may be feeling fear, or we as adults may be feeling fear in terms of our Muslim identity, and what may happen, if we exit the home, or if we're in a space that is not friendly in terms of approaching those who are Muslim. We may feel fear in terms of backlash. We are hearing left and right, and we just recently saw what happened to our Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, on the censuring in Congress that occurred to her. We are seeing, doctors being removed from their positions. We are seeing teachers being removed because of a post maybe that they made, something that they said. We are hearing that pro-Palestinian protesters may be under scrutiny, may be identified. Students on college campuses are being identified. So the fear that we may be feeling, it's a khawf that Allah Azza wa Jal tells us He will test us with. And subhanAllah, when you look at that verse, you see that Allah Azza wa Jal, He lists other tests as well. Naqsan fil amwal, right? A loss of wealth, naqsan fil, a loss of wealth, a loss of lives, a loss of fruit and livelihood. But the very first fear He talks of, the very first test Allah Azza wa Jal speaks to us of, is the test of fear. And yet, subhanAllah, when we look to those who are suffering in Palestine, when we look to those in Gaza who are being bombed consistently, we're seeing the numbers now are over 10,000 of people who have been killed in Gaza. Um, we don't really see fear on their faces. And their test may be a loss of life. Their test may be a loss of fruit. Their test may be many of the losses that Allah Azza wa Jal says He will test us with, but we don't see fear quite as much. And subhanallah, part of the research that I had done when I was researching the outlook of refugees, and particularly Syrian refugees, around 2015, 2016, what I wanted to look at was emotional resilience. And what was it that caused people who were going through the hardest of circumstances, who were losing families, losing, homes, losing everything, very much like what we are seeing in Palestine right now in Gaza. What is it that when you ask them, are you okay? Tell me your story. They would share, I have lost this family member. I have lost that family member. I've lost my home that was, I've had for generations. And they would always end with, but alhamdulillah. And that sense of hamd, that sense of rida, that sense of contentment, that gratitude, that gratefulness, to me, I wanted to find out, where does this come from? How do people who go through such hard circumstances maintain emotional resilience? And what the research showed was that there were three elements consistently that appeared in those who were emotionally resilient. And the first was a sense of faith, truly believing in a faith anchor, truly believing in Allah, believing that Allah Azza wa Jal would help one survive. And if it was not written for one to survive, then Allah Azza wa Jal would help them through whatever it is that they are struggling with. And so that faith was critical, and it is critical today as well. And the second component is hope. Allah Azza wa Jalla in the Quran reminds us, لا تقنطوا من رحمة الله. Do not despair from the mercy of Allah. And this is so important in terms of maintaining hope. So that when we see those who are suffering, when our children ask, why do people have to suffer? Knowing that Allah's mercy is greater than any human suffering. Allah's mercy is greater than any human harm. That this is where hope is rooted. And the last element of emotional resilience is community. Community, family, those around you lifting you up, helping you through this. And many of the statements that we're seeing out of the victims in Gaza are people who will say things such as, we have passed the test that Allah has given us. It is now up to the rest of the world to be tested. Meaning, what is it that we are doing, particularly when we may feel helpless, when we may feel like, we're not sure what to do when we see so much suffering. And so, again, our test is a test. And this is, again, the first test that we're reminded of in this verse. Our test is a test of fear, right? Allah Azza wa Jal tests each person in a way that they can handle. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah will never test a soul with a burden greater than that soul can bear. And so maybe, when our children look at those who are suffering, those who are losing their lives, those who are being harmed, we let them know that this is the test of these people. Allah Azza wa Jal knows that this is the test that is written for them, and it could be a means of purification. It could be a means and a pathway for them to reach Jannah, inshallah, as shuhada. This is their test. Our test may be different. And so many times I'll hear people saying, I feel bad, complaining about the loss of my job, or, the loss of my income, or, the fight I got into with my boss, or a child, worrying about things that are happening in the school and saying, I feel bad that I'm upset about this because there are people that are dying in Gaza. There are innocent children that are losing limbs and losing lives. But in those moments, we want to be able to remind our children of that verse in the Quran, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, that Allah gives us the tests that we need, not the tests that we want. We don't choose our tests, right? Allah Azza wa Jal knows us better than we know ourselves. Allah is closer to us than our jugular vein. And so he will test us in a way that is best for us, even if it may not be something that in the moment we fully understand. This is where the faith comes in. This is where the hope comes in. And this is where the sense of community is important. Right now, many of our children may be feeling very alone. They may be feeling different. They may be feeling like they stand out. They may be hearing a lot of negative comments, whether it's from friends or classmates, or if they're on social media, or if they turn on the news, or if they're reading articles. Just a lot of comments that may be very harmful to their self view and their self concept if they are not firmly anchored in who they are, and if they don't have the power of ilm that Allah Azza wa Jal tells us is so important to garner, to know who they are and to understand the situation better. So, if we go back to kind of the chronological order of how we have seen things unfolding over the past month, things that, contextually have been a cause of great stress, a cause of grief, a cause of difficulty, and a cause of really seeking out, ways that we can lift each other up, lift our brothers and sisters in Gaza and Palestine up as well, and also guide our children through it. So when we go back to the chronology of it, again, we see in early October, the situation arose. We heard the news outlets. We saw an equating of what it means to be Muslim, what it means to follow Islam with something that, of course, is not part of our deen, something that has nothing to do with Islam, which is the harming of innocence, and the harming of innocents who are not in an act of war at that time. And then we see that the follow up with the retaliation, we began to see a great deal of misinformation. So, first we would hear about, for example, the bombing of a hospital, and then we would be hearing another view that the hospital was not bombed by an airstrike, but the hospital was actually bombed by Hamas. And we would consistently hear the terminology of Hamas used over and over again. Our children are not immune to this. Our children are hearing this, and they're hearing it not just from the news and social media and from adult conversations, or even in the classroom. They're hearing it from students, and those students around them are picking it up from their homes and from their classrooms. And again, this is why ilm is so important, because when the ilm is not there, when the knowledge is not there, our children are susceptible to believing whatever it is that surrounds them. So, contextually speaking, guiding our children from a historical sense all the way back to World War I, and then moving towards World War II, and what happened at the end of World War II, guiding them through again an age appropriate understanding of what was the Balfour Agreement. And again, if you're speaking to a kindergartner or first grader, you might just want to call it an agreement. If you're speaking to a middle schooler, a high schooler, then you definitely want to give more of that historical context. But of course, we can't teach that which we don't know. And this is why the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it is incumbent upon each and every one of us to seek knowledge, even if it is as far away as China. Meaning, we have to learn, we have to educate ourselves, we have to know the sources that we're looking at. And as much as WhatsApp can be of benefit, we also know that there can be great harm when we are following a thread where misinformation can be introduced. Seek out the sources that will provide you with historically the context that is truthful, that provides a kind of a rundown of how things occurred, and timelines, and key characters. We need to educate ourselves in order to have that ilm to be able to educate our children, because we know that when something is erased from the history books, when something is changed, this can be a narrative that's perpetuated. And we see it as clearly as something like growing up here in the US, when October 10th, or whenever it was, I think it was the second or third Monday in October, we grew up knowing it was Columbus Day. And, in our schools, everyone celebrated Columbus, and we thought Columbus was great. He discovered America. And it wasn't until years later that, and now I think there's more awareness. With more ilm, there becomes more awareness. With the greater awareness, there is an understanding now and a change in the name itself, even, and it's Indigenous Peoples Day rather than Columbus Day, recognizing that as essentially again colonialism, and as someone who went in and decided to remove a people from their homes, that Columbus was not someone to be celebrated per se, that there was actually great tragedy that occurred to the Native Americans who were in this land first. But how many years did it take to change the narrative? And the narrative that we grew up with is very different than the narrative that our children, alhamdulillah, are growing up with, where they are better equipped now in terms of ilm to understand even the history of the country in which they live. So seek out that education, know the history yourself, take a look at the maps of Palestine and what did Palestine look like? What area of land, what did it look like in, the 1942 era? What did it look like in 1946? What happened in 1947 and 1948? What happened in 1967? And, again, this is not the historical lecture, but alhamdulillah, I have been seeing so many teach-ins occurring, whether at the university, at the masajid, online. Go to sources that know their history as well, right? Seek out the sources of ilm that are of benefit, that can educate you so that you can then in turn educate your children. So now, what happens when our children maybe are with us, and we're starting to see the impact of stress, the impact of grief on our kids? And again, for many of us, we may not even realize how it's impacting us, right? The consistent consumption of social media, the consistent consumption of messages on WhatsApp groups, it's almost like for many of us, our eyes are glued to the screen, and we find that it becomes hard almost to transition, right? We have work to do, but our WhatsApp is dinging and we want to check. Maybe we have our news window open. We're constantly checking that. Maybe we're on Twitter and we're seeing the posts that occur, and we can't help but react sometimes negatively when we hear misinformation, when we see misinformation. But the reality is that we as adults also need to take a break, because it will impact how we parent. It will impact how we interact. It will impact, if we are teaching in a school, it will impact how we interact with the students we teach. If we are a mentor, it will impact them as well. So keeping in mind the importance of zuhd, right? Allah Azza wa Jal guides us towards an understanding of zuhd, which is detachment, right? Detachment does not mean to silo yourself, ignore everything and say, you know what, this is too much for me, so I'm just not going to get involved. I'm not going to be part of anything. I'm not going to educate myself. No, that's not what zuhd is. Zuhd is being able to step away from the dunya while aligning yourself and realigning yourself to that central point that we had spoke about in the very start, which is the remembrance of Allah, the detachment from the dunya, so that our hearts can be attached to that which is greater. So meaning, we put that phone down and we take that salah break. We put that phone down and we recite Quran together as a family. We remind one another of the importance of dhikr. Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran reminds us that verily it is with the remembrance of Allah that hearts find ease. Right? That in remembering Allah, that ألا بذكر الله ألا بذكر الله تطمئن القلوب, that it is surely but by the remembrance of Allah that our hearts find ease. So taking that time for dhikr. We may notice that our children, maybe they're more on edge, maybe the siblings are arguing more often, maybe they're not doing as well in school, maybe their grades are dropping. Stress can manifest itself in different ways with different children, and not everybody processes grief or stress in the same way. So your child may be reacting out of anger, right? Your child may be raising his or her voice. Your child may be having trouble sitting still. Your child may be acting in ways that are uncharacteristic, and you may be reacting to the behavior of that child, maybe giving a timeout or saying, don't act that way. But you would be reacting in that point to the symptom, not to the cause. And we need to also be able to dig at the cause. So realize that our children are going to be affected and impacted by what they see. When the 6-year-old in Chicago, Wadia, rahimahullah, when he was killed by the landlord in an act of hate, a hate crime, an act of Islamophobia. I know that this really impacted all of us here in the US, because to recognize and see that the vileness of misinformation and the way that social media infiltrates our life, how it can cause someone to have so much hate towards a Muslim family simply because they're Muslims, simply because they're Arabic speakers, simply because the person who really acted upon this hate was essentially inspired by what he was seeing online. And I know that impacts all of us very deeply. But again, we cannot let fear cripple us, right? We cannot let that test of fear be something that holds us back. It should simply be that which motivates us and moves us forward, so that the death of Wadi'a, Allah yarhamu, so that the pain of his parents is not something that is lost, but it's something that becomes essentially the that which inspires us to want to seek the pleasure of Allah by giving more da'wah, by reaching out to people, by connecting with others and teaching them the beauty of Islam. And at the same time, by aiding our brothers and sisters in Gaza who are losing their lives, who are losing, everything that may have built over generations, by aiding them in the best way that we can, and guiding our children towards a sense of feeling more empowered, that maybe they are not able to do much more than make dua. Then that's what they should do. Make dua for those who are suffering, but make dua for themselves as well. Make dua for their families. Make dua for the hidayah of those who may not understand Islam, but making positive dua rather than reacting negatively. And of course, we see that mercy and compassion that we spoke about in the character of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was also ridiculed. He was also harmed. He was also put down in the town of Ta'if by the disbelievers when he went into the town expecting to be welcomed, expecting that he would be able to teach La ilaha illallah, and he was rejected. And yet, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam's response was not one of bitterness. It was not one of anger. It was not a response that was devoid of compassion or mercy. It was quite the opposite. When Allah Azza wa Jal sent the angel Jibreel alayhi salam to speak to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam as he sat in the meadow after going through such difficulty, Jibreel alayhi salam asked the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, just say the word and Allah will command the angels of the mountains to bring those mountains together and crush the people of Ta'if. And the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam said no. He said no, because maybe the children of Ta'if or the children of Ta'if will one day say La ilaha illallah. And it's so important that our children see us model this type of behavior, where rather than hearing us, curse out the aggressors or speak ill even of the oppressors, being able to really act upon prophetic character in making sincere dua and asking Allah Azza wa Jal to guide those who are misguided towards hidayah, asking Allah Azza wa Jal to bring about that ilm al-nafi'an, right? Beneficial knowledge, and to allow them to be a source of that ilm al-nafi'a, of that beneficial knowledge towards others. But there are so many beautiful du'as that we can recite and that we can teach our children to help them feel more empowered. And, for some families, maybe taking their children to a protest is a way to help them connect with that sense of community. Remember the three elements of resilience that we talked about: faith, hope, and community. And sometimes, going for the late night tahajjud, the prayers, I know several of the masajid were working together to select specific evenings in which every masjid would hold a special dua for Palestine, for the people of Gaza, bringing our children to these gatherings. We are there introducing to them, of course, the elements of hope and faith and community. So, trying to secure those avenues and those ways of connecting our children to that which will uplift them, and that in so doing, reminding them that those who are suffering, they do need our dua, and they do need our action within our capabilities. And those actions must always be actions that are informed by mercy and compassion, because that is the Lord we serve. That is Allah Azza wa Jal. He is Allah who is the most compassionate and the most merciful, and we want to consistently embody that. Now, how do we deal with sadness? And what does sadness look like? No, we know, of course, that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced elements and moments of sadness in his life. We know the year of sadness, عام الحزن, that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam experienced after the death of Khadija radiallahu anha and his beloved uncle. And we know it was a sadness that he recognized. We know that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon burying his infant son Ibrahim, he shed tears. And as he shed those tears, he repeated a beautiful dua in which he said that the العين تدمع والقلب يحزن, the eyes shed tears and the heart feels sadness, but the tongue only speaks that which is pleasing to Allah. So we know that sadness exists, and sadness is a human emotion. So when we ourselves feel sadness, it's important that our children recognize and see and understand that we do feel grief, and we feel grief and sorrow for those who are struggling and those who are losing their lives. And it's important that when our children feel sadness, that we recognize it, that we validate it, that we let them know that even the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt sadness, and that when we feel that sadness, it is a natural expulsion of the emotion to shed tears, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And it means that we have a soft heart, and that soft heart is a blessing from Allah. So, reminding our children that it is okay to feel emotions, that they should feel these emotions, but also reminding them how to channel that grief and that sorrow into something positive. Because if we don't, then it can easily be channeled into anger. And this is where, again, we're reminded by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do not become angry, do not become angry, do not become angry. And so many times we see our children and ourselves as well reacting to what is evoking sorrow, what is evoking grief, reacting to it in an act of anger. And that has never benefited anyone. And this is why it is so, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam insisted upon it in our deen not to feel anger. Because when and then there's a difference between being angry and feeling angry. So yes, we may feel anger, absolutely. We feel anger at injustice, we feel anger at oppression, we feel anger at what we are seeing in the world that is harming others. But feeling anger is different than being angry, right? And the hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, do not become angry, right? Because when you become angry, you act in anger, which is very different than feeling anger. Acting in anger means we lose our sense of emotional control, and that is often when we can harm others. And so we don't ever want to act in anger. We don't want to become angry, but we can recognize that the feeling of anger is justified. And we can recognize that when we see injustice, yes, we will have a responsive anger when there is injustice occurring. But how will we act? And this is where we act in holding on to those elements we talked about, holding on to our faith and strengthening our faith, holding on to hope and strengthening and spreading that hope, and building that sense of community and connecting. We're reminded by the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that there will come a time when holding on to your faith will be like holding on to a hot coal. We've been there before. For those of us who have, lived through the time post September 11th, we know that holding on to our faith was definitely a hot coal. For those of us currently who are experiencing, backlashes, maybe in work, who our children are experiencing backlashes in school, whether from teachers or from students, our faith is again like a hot coal. And just because it gets hotter, it doesn't mean that we drop it, right? It just means that we learn how to wear thicker gloves and we continue to hold on to that coal. And empowering our children to feel strong enough to hold on to their faith means helping them understand their faith. I have been hearing from a lot of, teens and adults alike, questions about justice and the justice of Allah, and that how can Allah Azza wa Jal, who is the most merciful, who is the most compassionate. How can Allah Azza wa Jal allow for innocent children to be killed in their homes, for hospitals to lose all their power, for the innocent, the weak, the crippled, the old, the young to go through such hardship? And subhanAllah, the questioning of that is something that can initially, especially if our children come up with these questions, initially our response may be, how can you ask that? This is not right. Don't ask that question. And yet there's a beautiful book by Dr. Jeffrey Lang, and it's called Even Angels Ask. And in the book, Dr. Jeffrey Lang references the verses in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah when the angels asked Allah, why are you creating human beings who will cause such chaos and difficulty on earth? And Allah Azza wa Jal answers the angels and says, I know that which you do not know. Right? There is a ilm that Allah Azza wa Jal has that we don't have. And so when our children ask this question, why would Allah let bad things happen to innocent people, right? We want to be able to respond to them. We don't want to shut them down or tell them, don't ask that question. When adults ask that question, when our neighbors, when our friends, when we ourselves maybe may feel this question, recognize that's a question that, even the angels who were created of light asked Allah. But then also understand that Allah Azza wa Jal in His infinite wisdom knows that which we don't know. And perhaps the best of places to see the wisdom of Allah, truly to grasp it, is in the verses of Surah Al-Kahf that we read, week after week after week, that we recite, that we listen to. The verses in Surah Al-Kahf of Al-Khidr and the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, in which the Prophet Musa alayhi salam asked this question as well. Again, it's a question that has been asked by the most pious of those that Allah Azza wa Jal has chosen to teach through them the lessons that we need to learn. And when the Prophet Musa alayhi salam wanted to understand the hikmah of Allah, he asked Allah Azza wa Jal to teach him. And so Allah Azza wa Jal guided him through a journey with Al-Khidr, who acted upon several commandments of Allah. And in the first, we see that there is a child who belongs to good parents, kind parents, pious parents, and the child is killed. And Musa alayhi salam asks Al-Khidr, how can this be? Even though he had promised Al-Khidr that he would not ask any more questions, the Prophet Musa alayhi salam was always curious by nature. And so he said, how can this be? This was a child who was innocent, and the parents are good people. And Al-Khidr responded and explained to the Prophet Musa that this was a child who, if he had grown older, would have harmed his parents, would have taken them away from the deen, would not have been a pious child. And by removing his life at this time, he is granted Jannah, and that this is essentially a gift to the parents. And so, in that moment, we see that there is a true manifestation of the verse in the Quran when Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us, "Asa an takrahu shay'an fahuwa khayrun lakum," that you may dislike a thing and there may be great good in that. And so we see that in the journey of Al-Khidr and the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, the next stop that they come to is a clearing in which boats are traveling across a body of water. And there is a group of poor fishermen who only have one boat, and they are good people, pious people. And a hole is placed in the bottom of their boat. And again, the Prophet Musa alayhi salam, who said he was not going to ask any questions, he can't fathom it because, again, these are good people and something that appears to be bad is happening to them. And so he asks the question again. And Al-Khidr alayhi salam responds and says that in this body of water, there is a king upon the other side who, when the boats that are whole and in good shape pass by, he takes those boats because this one has a hole in it and it will not, survive the journey. Essentially, it will not be taken by the king. And so we see a great good that occurs, a harm that is deflected from good people, even though they may think that something bad has happened. And in the final step of the journey of Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr, we see that they enter into a town in which people are not kind to them, and there is a crumbling wall, and Al-Khidr begins to rebuild it. And the Prophet Musa alayhi salam again can't understand it. He says, these are not good people. These are not kind people. Why would you give them something that is good? And Al-Khidr explains to Musa alayhi salam that there are orphans in this village and that there is a kins, a treasure that is in these walls. And if the wall were to crumble, the people of the town would take the treasure. But by rebuilding it, it would be reserved for those orphans. And so, when our children come to us with these questions, do not deflect them, do not reject them, do not push them away, do not tell them that they shouldn't be asking these questions or they shouldn't think in this way. Because, as the title of the book reminds us, even angels ask that we should recognize that these questions are natural, but our iman is what guides us through. And when we see what is occurring today in Gaza and we see the resilience of the people who continue to stand, who continue to make dua, who continue to say Alhamdulillah, who continue to show us resilience, we can learn from them and we can recognize that truly maybe the test is a test for us, that the test of fear that we are feeling is being tested within us in seeing that which others are going through, in seeing that Allah Azza wa Jal protects people in different ways. And their protection may be, through this pathway, and it may be a protection that will allow them to enter into Jannah. Now, from a practical standpoint, because we wanted to incorporate, the elements of what can we do when our children are reacting to stress or reacting to grief in a way that does manifest itself as anger or fidgeting or difficulty concentrating or not being able to focus. And one of my favorite grounding techniques is actually, a grounding technique that, although it's rooted in supposedly, Western psychology, we actually find the roots of it in our Islamic history, as we see in so many different psychiatric and psychological approaches. And this grounding technique is called the 5-4-3-2-1 method. And essentially, it's when you see, an adult or a child, and it tends to work really well with children, though, when you see them beginning to exhibit anxious signs. And those anxious signs may be, as I mentioned, a shaking of the hands. Sometimes there's like a nervousness, sometimes it can be anger. Sometimes it can manifest in, wanting to fight or to argue. The anxious signs, exhibit themselves differently depending on each person. But if you see that sense of anxiety and maybe, in a moment of calm and quietude, teaching your child that when the child feels anxious, feels their heart racing, feels their thoughts running in consistent thought loops, finds themselves having difficulty, detaching from their phone or from their laptop, or feeling, overwhelmed maybe in certain spaces, telling them to first, take a moment to sit in quietude and solitude. Again, we see in Surah Al-Kahf, right? There are three youth that the surah actually focuses on, that the surah begins with. Three youth that go into a cave to stay away from the fitna of the world around them. We know that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam would reflect in Ghar Hira, right, to try to find his center. So telling our children to step away from that which is causing them the anxious thoughts. And once they step away, even if it's just going to another room, stepping away from people a little bit, if it's on the playground, maybe going into a corner, and then standing for a moment and looking around and identifying 5 things they can see. And if they're outside and maybe they look up and they see the sun and they think, Subhanallah, maybe they look and see a friend and they identify the friend. Maybe they look and see, if they're indoors, they see the table, identifying things they can see. For our middle schoolers, for our teenagers, for those who may have an iPhone, a laptop, a Chromebook, having them save a verse from the Quran on their screen, or something that brings them calm. Maybe it's a picture of their family, a picture of their cat, something that brings peace to their heart. But let them identify 5 things they can see and let them name those 5 things. Then the next element is 4 things that they can touch. And one of the first things that we talk about in the aspect of touch is pushing upon pressure points. And there was a study that came out in 2013 that said when you push upon the uqlas, the back of the knuckles, right, it actually acts like acupuncture, and it instigates the calming mechanisms within the body, and releases the hormones that allow the cortisol. So it releases the serotonin, which allows the cortisol to decrease. It decreases the stress hormone essentially. And when you push, you're supposed to repeat a positive mantra. Now, subhanAllah, when we think about our deen, when Fatima radiallahu anha felt overwhelmed by the workload that she had in the house, and she spoke to her father, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and said, there is too much work. I need someone to help me. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to her, can I teach you something that will be greater than any help that a person can provide? And she said, yes. And he taught her the tasbih, to say Subhanallah, 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 Subhanallah 33 times, to say Alhamdulillah 33 times, to say Allahu Akbar 33 times. And when we look at that power of touch and we teach our children the importance of being able to say Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, we see that that aspect of touch induces the calming mechanisms within the body and brings that state of anxiety down a little bit from the heightened level that it may be at. So teach your children that the next step, so 5 things they can see, then 4 things they can touch, starting with tasbih. And after they commit to that tasbih, even if it's just subhanallah, alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, then maybe they touch their clothes and they say, I feel how soft my sweater is, right? I touch the table, I feel how hard the table is. So utilizing those senses. After 4 things they can touch, it's 3 things that they can smell. Because a lot of times when someone is exhibiting anxious behaviors or experiencing an anxious episode, we tell them, take deep breaths. But when the mind is moving at like 100 miles an hour, you're not able to stop it to get into that mode of taking deep breaths until you almost trick the mind into moving through the senses. So you've already gone through the sense of sight, you've identified 5 things you can see, you've gone through the sense of touch and identified 4 things you can touch. Now you're ready to breathe. But you're doing it through the process of 3 things you can smell. So at that point, again, you might want to help your children create a little toolkit, especially if they're prone to anxious behaviors and anxious responses. Create a little toolkit. And in that toolkit, place items that they can touch, items they can see, something they can smell. Maybe there is a perfume. Maybe if you're home, there's a oud, a bukhur that can help. But inhaling and exhaling in what we call an H breath. So it's in through the nose and out with a from the back of the throat. So, and as our children do that, that in itself is again going to introduce a sense of calm. So 3 things you can smell, then it's 2 things you can hear. And again, if you have your children record, maybe they can record your voice if they have a cell phone, an Apple Watch, a laptop. And again, I'm not a proponent of those from a young age, but for the older teens and young adults, maybe having a recording maybe of something that gives them a sense of calm, right? But 2 things you can hear, even if they're just, on the playground, just pausing and listening, and maybe they hear a bird, maybe they hear their friends laughing, just again getting to that place of quietude. And then the last one is very important. It's one thing they can taste. And when you have a baby that cries, right, you give them a pacifier, not because they're hungry, but because when they make that sucking motion with their mouth, it again activates the saliva glands that allows the body to feel a sense of calm and safety. And so having your children carry with them something like a sour patch, a warhead, something that, if you're an adult, sometimes it's a drop of honey or a black seed, something that's prophetic. But placing something on your tongue, maybe it could be a lemon, an ice cube that makes you go into that sucking motion, that can also help in terms of grounding. And after doing the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, again, whether it's in a moment of high anxiety, in a moment of deep sadness, in a moment of difficulty, in a moment when you're losing sight of the mercy of Allah, go through this process. Anchor yourself again. Bring yourself to a place where you are reminded of the verse in Surah At-Tawbah when Allah tells us, do not be sad, right? Allah reminds us, لا تحزن إن الله معنا, that Allah is with us, right? Allah is always with us. And bringing ourselves back to that faith anchor is so critical in being able to get through difficult times. So I realize we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I know we wanted to have some time for question and answer. I know I did get two questions in the chat box, I believe, previously, but I'll pause here in case the organizers want to step in and say something, and then we'll continue with the question and answer. Okay, I don't know if the organizers are in the window still,
No,
so
I'm so sorry. I was on mute. But Jazakallah khair, sister. This was an amazing talk, and subhanAllah, exactly something that I needed to hear, not just as a parent, but as an individual who's been struggling with this topic as well, like with our brothers and sisters in Palestine and what we can do with it. I do see that you have a couple questions in the comments. The questions that we ended up getting through the spreadsheet was actually a lot of it was answered by you. Um, and I think to summarize overall, I think there's two questions that I would like to highlight. You did touch upon it, but I just to for emphasis. Um, yes, there is grief regarding what's happening with our brothers and sisters in Palestine. Yes, there is this need for sense of justice. However, I think a lot of us, including myself, we're struggling with guilt. How do we deal with guilt? Yes, stress and grief, and yes, all that comes together. But I think for us who live in the United States, where our tax dollars are funding this, we're buying products, Disney Plus, that's something that I have for my children, right? Fine, Starbucks and McDonald's we can give up, but there's so many things that are integrated in our lives. A Dove soap, I've already bought it. How do we handle the guilt of unknowingly supporting uh, this siege, this occupation, and then also the guilt of living here comfortably in a country that is also supporting it, right? So how do we sort that our feelings? What should we do? Yes, there's dua, there's that, but there's anything else that we could do mentally for us to strengthen?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, and I think what's important for us to realize is that there has always been suffering in this dunya, right? And it started with the children of Adam, right? Who, one son murdered another, right? And that was an act of injustice, essentially, right? That upon the one who was murdered. There have always been wars. There has, for example, the tragedies that are occurring in Sudan began much earlier than October 7th, right? There has been
Mhm.
the tragedies happening all around the world, and yet a lot of times we are able to continue functioning and moving on in our lives because we feel very removed from it. We may not be feeling as present as we are feeling currently with what is happening in Gaza. So first of all, recognizing that injustice exists in this dunya, and that's why this is dunya and it's not Jannah. How we decide to respond to that injustice, within our capacity, within what we can do, that is what we are going to be judged upon. That is what Allah Azza wa Jal will call us into account for. And we know the hadith of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which we are reminded that there are three levels of iman. Right, the strongest level of iman is that when we see something wrong, we change it with our hands. And for those of us who are able to change with our hands, and maybe that means physically attending a protest, maybe it means canceling our Disney Plus if we can, not going to Starbucks and Walmart and wherever else the BDS list kind of guides us
Mhm.
towards. If we can do that, then we do it, and that is a strong form of iman. But we also know that there is a level of iman which is somewhat weaker, but is still a level of iman, which is to change injustice or to change that which we see that is wrong with our tongue. Those of us who are able to speak out, we should speak out and not let the test of fear hold us back. Yes, there are situations in which the way that we speak may be held against us, but if we are speaking with mercy and compassion, if we are following the prophetic model in guiding people, educating people, that's incumbent upon us, then we should do it. But to remember not to act in anger, because when we become angry, that is when our comments can also reflect that anger and be devoid of mercy and compassion. And there is
Mhm.
still yet another level of iman, and it is the weakest form of iman, but still a level of iman, which is to dislike something in our heart. And so rather than feeling guilt, asking ourselves, where is my iman? How can I act upon my level of iman? Do I have the capacity to change something with my hand? And maybe it is something as small as, tomorrow, November 9th, I know we are being told to have an economic halt, essentially, an economic boycott,
Mhm.
not purchase anything. Is that something that we can do? That would be a change with hand. Is there something verbally? Can I talk to my neighbor? Can I talk to my colleague? Can I post some information online that is positive, that incorporates mercy and compassion, that is not done out of anger, that may educate someone? If so, I do it. And if I cannot do any of that, then in my heart, can I dislike the act of oppression? Can I dislike the act of injustice? And can I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to grant relief for those who are suffering? That is something we can all do.
MashaAllah khair, jazakallah khair. I think that's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. Um, The last one, and you touched upon this already, and there was great points on how to reach your children. I think, but I like this topic because I had to deal with teenagers and how to talk to them, right? One of the questions was that my son is asking me, why did Hamas started the war? He's in high school, and his non-Muslim friends are telling him a very different story. So like the parent is struggling on how to communicate with their child. Obviously, exactly as you mentioned, that our children are being exposed to this from different point of views, whether we like it or not, in their schools, by their peers, in their workplaces. So how can we as a parent find the right resources to show, because high schoolers, they want proof, right? So how can we show them the right, the truth, actually, not
Yeah.
just the right perspective, but just the truth.
Yes. So definitely as parents, as educators, we want to be the source of that knowledge, right? Because we know that the misinformation and the propaganda campaigns that are out there are mind-boggling. So as I mentioned, I know in the past week in our local masajid in the central New Jersey area, I think there were like 3 or 4 teach-ins that were occurring where, experts in the field, and I am in no way an expert on the history of Palestine, but there are experts in the field that were holding teach-ins. Go to the teach-ins, take your children. I know many of them were recorded. If you look them up online, look at the different experts in that field. I know Professor Noura Arakat, for example, is very well known in the field. She's local, I believe, in the New Jersey area currently. There's other professors who have spent a lot of time researching this, but there are also scholars who come at the topic from a religious perspective as well. I know Yaqeen Institute just released a curriculum for teaching on the topic of Palestine, and they gathered information from experts in the field. So it's very important for us to first of all recognize what we don't know, right? So that we don't pretend we know things if we don't know it, to seek out the expertise of those who have made it their lifelong work, to study and understand these elements, and to go to those trusted sources. So I highly recommend, looking at the Yaqeen curriculum that was just released. Take a look at your local masajid, at the teach-ins that are happening. I know there are several books on what happened, for example, researching the Naqaba, for example, researching the massacres of Dar Yassin, researching the Balfour Agreement. So there's definitely a great deal of research we can do. Just make sure that you know whose work you're reading first. And I say the bio of the author is more important sometimes than what it is that you're just Googling. It's important to know who you're researching from and go to those trusted sources.
No, definitely. And a point to add to this is that I was coming across a couple videos um, in which they had like IDS soldiers laughing, and they're like, "Oh, here are the people in America and everywhere buying free Palestine and Palestinian quote unquote items. Turns out they're actually being sold by the army and getting 20% of that." So be very, very careful on where you're purchasing supporting items or what books you're purchasing, because you just don't know where that money is going. So please do your research on the authors as well as the items and where they're coming from. But thank you, Sister Suzy. Last question, inshallah, and then we'll wrap it up. And this is from another parent, is that, because of the situation, I can relate to it. I was in fifth grade when 9/11 happened, and my last name was Hussein, so that was a lot of fun. But bullying, unfortunately, is a problem, and unfortunately, our children now have to go through this aspect where they're identified as Muslims and being pose this question as, why are you being a terrorist? Why are you this? Why are you that? So a parent is also coming back. It's like, what should we do when our child comes to us and tells us they're being bullied and being called Hamas?
Yeah.
How should we handle that situation? What should we do?
So that's a very, very good question. And just, very quickly before I answer that one, I also see in the comments a good question by Sister Shima that I just want to address very quickly.
Hmm.
You mentioned, for example, September 11th and how many of us felt, growing up in that era. But when we think back to 2001, we did not have the inundation of social media. Of There was no Instagram back then, there was no Snapchat, there was no 24/7 WhatsApp, right? So what Sister Shima is saying, for example, is she's watching videos and they're very traumatic and they're hard to watch, and there's a sense of losing your sanity, but she also feels like she wants to be able to learn. I do think that our children currently are being so bombarded by the visual that it is taking a very big toll on them. And even for us, to a certain extent, you can also become desensitized to, that which is very violent, when you consistently watch these things. And this is why Allah Azza wa Jal guides us to also protect our eyes, right? Because the eyes can often lead to the way that our heart is swayed. So I would say, like, limiting the amount of access to videos. I mean, personally, I'm a reader. I prefer to read things than to watch videos. I don't watch any videos really on any of the things that are happening. I think when you read something in print, you are better able to digest it. You're also able to sift through it and to better understand the context of what's happening. I would encourage us to guide our children also back towards the lost art of reading, and give them reading materials, rather than constantly, pummeling them and ourselves with videos that can be very graphic. So with that said, to answer the question on bullying, alhamdulillah, we are again living in a time where from 2001 to today, more than 20 years ago now, we as a Muslim community have grown, and we've evolved, and we've understood what it means to be Muslim American, because we are Muslim American, our children are Muslim American, and that part of being American means that we also need to kind of stake our place in a country that is our home, and that for many of us now, our children are second and third generation. We're not in kind of a state of trying to resettle, trying to integrate. No, we are Americans. We are Muslim Americans. And when a child is bullied, it's important that we follow the pathways that we now have. So immediately reach out to your local care office. If it is a situation of harassment, if the situation has been escalated to the school teacher, to the principal, and they have not done anything about it, then you take it to that next level. As a parent, it is incumbent upon you to protect your child. So if a child comes to you and says, the school friends or people at school are calling me Hamas or calling me terrorist, you let your child know that is not okay. And with your child, sit with them and say, this is a situation where it's a teachable moment. Your child may say, no, 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 I don't want to get embarrassed. Don't tell the teacher. It's not a big deal. I'll fix it myself. But if you are able to guide your child towards an understanding of the empowerment that exists in standing up for your rights, in teaching them that it is their right to be safe in school, it is their right to be protected from harassment, it is their right to feel a sense of self that should not be negotiated in any way because of their faith and their identity and who they are. Guide them towards that, empower them, and let them know that they have every right to take those next steps, and that they are not a snitch or a tattletale if they were to do that. And the more we are able to get our children to toe the line and say, enough, like, I will not allow you to belittle or demean me or my religion. That's how we empower our children. We're able to also guide them towards understanding how to stand for their rights. So I would say, as a parent, do what you need to do to get the children to understand how serious this really is.
Definitely. Um, and Susie, like, I would like to add, like, find that, be an advocate for your child, talk to the teacher. I feel like, my own son, he is 8 years old, he's in third grade, went through bullying as well, but I shut that down real fast. I immediately emailed the teacher and I was like, no, this is what's happening. I'm not comfortable. I need you to move his seat in your classroom, right? Advocate for your child because, if they're coming to you and telling you that this is happening and you are like, don't worry, just ignore it, then they're never going to come back to you again. So if that child opens a door for you guys, go and advocate. Exactly like how Sister Susie said, go to the teacher, go to the principal, escalate to care, see what it needs to be done. Be that voice for your child because you are their number one protector, subhanAllah. Um, Mana Jazakallah khair, Sister Susie. That's all that we have. Relatively everything else was just addressed in your talk, which was amazing. This is going to be a recording for everyone to rewatch. So I please, if you guys joined in halfway through, go ahead and onto our YouTube channel. This was an amazing talk to deal with the situation, to find our resolve, to trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make dua for our brothers and sisters in Palestine and Gaza specifically. And inshallah khair, hopefully we can increase our levels of iman and make more of an impact that we can while keeping our cup full, inshallah khair. Sister Susie, I'm going to wrap it up. If there's anything else from you? If not, inshallah khair, we'll end the session.
No, I think if we can all just together make a collective dua for Palestine and for the easing of the suffering of those in Gaza, may Allah Azza wa Jal grant them relief from their suffering. May Allah Azza wa
Ameen.
Jal strengthen our iman and our tawakkul and allow us to be a means of ease for those who are going through difficulty. May Allah Azza wa Jal allow us to succeed in our tests and allow those who are tested in Gaza to enter into His mercy, into His rahmah as shuhada, inshallah.
Inshallah
جزاكم
khair.
الله خير
Ameen.
والسلام عليكم.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much again.